Somebody hit a light switch, please. Anybody hit a light switch, please. Nobody hit a light switch. Ah, see, it always works. Welcome. Today I was imagining how many great images and stories we would hear, and I was getting a precursor to that from David, and it's there could be 10 lectures, 20 lectures here, but the connection between SCI-Arc and Russia, then USSR, began in 1988 when Ray and Shelley Cappy and myself took 8 students to Moscow to begin an exchange which lasted approximately 10 years with the Moscow Institute. We were asked, in retrospect I realized that we were asked to witness and in some ways participate in the reawakening of a great civilization which had taken pause for a brief period. I say brief period when you think of it in terms of geologic time, from its grand experiment. This experiment is now beginning again at full tilt. Our speaker tonight is at the epicenter. The issue, I think, which is evident in some ways in the United States, but I think in places which, with such a deep and present history, the issue is how to deal with the relationship between the inevitability of change and the fear that humans have of change. So the intentions, the actions, and the debates that occurred 80 years ago in Russia seem to be happening again. What may be different now is the ideas that catalyzed the debates were local then. They are no longer local, they're global. So that the discussions and the debates that are occurring are also global. The upside of globalization is the exchange of ideas that become our common language, and they're grounded in a particular place and develop special meaning, which enriches whatever form that they ultimately take on. While thinking about this evening, the stirrings that I had, I put down in this way. It's about the eternal return, the reawakening of a great civilization. How life emerges at the point of equilibrium between, new life emerges at the point of equilibrium between memory and creation. This is a sacred moment, the potential of which is always present, but not always realized. There have been brief periods in human history when the space surrounding this moment was inhabited by men and women who were highly articulate and intelligent activists, artists. One such moment and people was the avant-garde culture that flourished in Russia immediately before and after the Russian Revolution of 1917. In the first quarter of the 20th century, as Russian political and social systems were undergoing critical upheavals, a concurrent revolution in all of the arts was taking place. It involved ways of thinking that encouraged tremendous experimentation. During this period, there was an unprecedented interaction among artists working in all media, many ignoring the traditional boundaries of their respective disciplines. They willingly exchanged ideas, but more significantly, they exchanged creative responsibilities. Poets became painters, painters designed for theater, and typically, architects tried to do everything. The emergent avant-garde aspired to a totally new system of visual and experiential aesthetics. This ran parallel to the social and political systems that not only supported this approach, but encouraged it. Life in art was to be redefined. Perhaps no other moment in history has known such creative growth in the face of political, social, and economic upheaval brought about by the revolutionary events of its time. The leading artists and architects of this period shared in the belief that all art should be rethought and rearranged. It would be irresponsible to merely reaffirm status quo. Tradition in its broadest sense was being challenged. The artists would soon be challenged as well. In natural systems, change is inevitable and constant. In human systems, change is easily conceptualized, but eventually we put up resistance with equal force. This was a great period for architecture. It was a time of great clarity of intention and of intelligence and optimism. What began in Russia was an architectural equivalent of the Big Bang. The irony is that as the pause button was pushed in Russia, the force moved primarily clockwise, east to west, and it has taken 70 years to return to its source. Timing is everything, as we all know. It returns to the source at a time when architecture, in the context of world culture, is beginning its next phase. Another conceptual revolution has begun, and as if by serendipity or divine intervention, Russia is poised and apparently willing to catalyze this new revolution. The issue is not whether great change will occur. It will, because it is the most profound fact of all realities. The issue is whether we decide to participate and lend our intelligence to it, and in some instances, our life as well, with the unshakable belief that it's the right thing to do. David Sarkissyan is doing just that. He's an architect and the director of the Shchusev State Museum of Architecture, which is bringing Russia to the world through the retrieval, archiving, and presentation of the great constructivist works of the recent past. He's also bringing the world to Russia with courageous projects like the Russian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which presented two large-scale proposals for the reconstruction of the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow and the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg. The comparison of the Bolshoi with an ideology of conservation and the Mariinsky with an ideology of revolution is perhaps the moment of conception for the rebirth of architecture in Russia. The Mariinsky was developed by an American team, along with an American team, the extraordinary developers who are here tonight, Frederick and Lori Smith, and our director here at SCI-Arc, Eric Owen Moss. The project, in its development strategies and aesthetic inventions, is a case study for living in the present with respect to intellectual content and emotional intensity. A combination also present among the avant-garde in Russia. David Sarkissyan is playing a significant role in the reawakening, the cultural reawakening of his country, and in doing so, making it possible for all of us to become aware once again of the fact that new life emerges at the point of equilibrium between memory and creation. We're honored to welcome David Sarkissyan into the SCI-Arc family. Please welcome him.
I flew from Moscow only today. I left my museum in the morning, and now I'm here. In a way, it is a fantastic thing of our modernity, that we can travel so quickly from the other side of the globe. On the other side, it's somehow dissatisfactory because it was too simple. No excitement, no... This is maybe the part of the globalization that is coming. I'm not very sure that the future is wonderful, to be honest. I think that there is a danger that we are falling into certain medieval period, because everything what is around us is cut in small pieces. It's a kind of a salad. People are losing understanding of, because the ties are disappearing between the systems are disappearing. That's why the main idea of my lecture would be that the museums in the modern world, in the coming world, are becoming more and more important. From their role of just archives, they are moving to a role of being very active. It is a global process, actually, everywhere. The museums become very actively influencing, because they are the centers of not only collecting items or collecting knowledge, they are also structuring somehow the understanding of what's going on. I would try to explain you that on the example of our museum, which is a very interesting story. Our museum, show please the first picture. This is the logo of our museum written in Russian. In Russian letters it's M-U-A-R, Museum of Architecture. Our museum is actually the first specialized museum, architectural museum in the world. It's not a very well-known fact, but we're not only the biggest architectural collection, but also the first one. It was established as an architectural museum in 1933. It was an idea of the Russian Union of Architects that they should have a museum specialized on architecture. And they did that. This museum was established. It was 1933. They received the territory of one of the old monasteries in which was the church was thrown out of that monastery, and they started to collect. It was called the Scientifical Museum of Architecture. And what they were, the specialists of that museum were running around the city of Moscow, collecting pieces of the destroyed buildings, because the Bolsheviks were destroying all the old architecture. So this was the name of the museum sounded somehow advanced. It was the Scientifical Museum of Architecture, meaning that they should collect something new. But they were collecting all the old stuff which was disappearing. I want to show you some pictures of the monastery where this museum was established, and also a few things of what they collected. This is the wall of the monastery, of Donskoy Monastery. Now it's returned to the church, and the museum left this headquarters. But since 1933, it was the place where the museum was started. Different images of the wall. So this is an example. When the famous Cathedral of Christ the Savior was destroyed, it was full of reliefs. It was covered by reliefs. There was a special commission that has chosen 8 pieces to be kept in the museum. So they are still kept. They were installed into the wall of the monastery, and they are still there. And they belong to our museum. Other pieces of other churches were saved by the specialists of the museum, and they brought that to the monastery, and they fixed them on the walls of the monastery. Also, the cemeteries were destroyed by the Bolsheviks because there was too much of religious symbolical things there. So, but this cemetery survived because it was announced as a museum item. These are the pieces of the destroyed triumphal arch of 1912. Which was also only one capital of like that was kept of something like 24. Now we brought that to the museum. It's now at our museum. So in 1946, another museum was established, which was let me find the picture. In 1946. Shchusev, who was at that moment the most important Soviet architect. He was the author of the Lenin's mausoleum. By the way, he also built the Russian pavilion in Venice, but that was in 1914. Shchusev said to Stalin, he was the beloved architect of Stalin, he said, you know, I want to create another museum of architecture. I want to call it the Museum of Russian Architecture. And Stalin gave him a building, which was in a very bad shape. I will show you the photo. This building. This was a wonderful palace built in 1780 in the very middle of Moscow. It is only 200 meters from the Kremlin, in a very bad shape. But this was the building that Shchusev received from Stalin. And he started I will show you some of the rooms of this building. This was a big hall. This lamp, for instance, this chandelier, was of the time of the Catherine the Great. It belongs to the building from the very beginning. When it was built, they installed this lamp. So you see they hanged such electrical bulbs from it, but they kept the lamp. Now we still have it. I will show you very quickly. This building had an interesting story. After the revolution, for 1 year and a half, Stalin lived in that building, actually in this room. Because when the Soviet government moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow, this was the best building close to Kremlin. They still didn't go to the Kremlin. So for a while they were occupying this building, and Stalin used to live in this building. Later, in the late 20s, it was given to the Red Army, and you see the situation it was a Red Army dormitory. The soldier was sleeping, and the building was in a horrible condition. But Shchusev made a miracle. He received the building, he restored that somehow, and he opened a museum. Here you see a photo of the museum of the Shchusev's time. And he started to collect. His museum was called the Museum of Russian Architecture, but actually he was collecting the modern stuff. We are obliged to him that with the most important portion of our collection for the collection of the Russian constructivism. We keep all the most important works of the constructivist period, and they were collected by Shchusev. Later he started to collect also the stuff that was produced by the Stalinist architects of the 30s and 40s, which the huge pictures of the Stalinist skyscrapers. It's a very interesting material. So this museum was very rich. In 1962, the two museums were united into one. So it became the biggest museum in the world. I mean, if you count the amount of stuff that we have, it is the biggest. If you count the price of what we are keeping, it is also the biggest, of course, because the things that we have are priceless. I will show you the whole of the museum right now. It's a recent photo from one of the exhibitions. Still, you see the same lamp hanging, which was, you remember that lamp. It's still hanging, it's still okay. We are going to restore it. I will show you a few other photos of the halls of the museum. The building is now in more or less good condition, and we are using that for and doing different exhibitions. Now, here you see, I'll show you now the image of the same room before the restoration. You see? Our collection is very, very big. I want to, if I describe it, it will be another lecture. I will tell you very shortly that we have 2 million photos. If we wouldn't have the wonderful buildings, if we wouldn't have the collection of architectural drawings, if we would have only the photos, we would be a great museum, because we have, for instance, the photos of the whole Russia, not only of St. Petersburg or Moscow, but of the whole mainland Russia, even of the Siberia, starting from 1853. And this material, with time going on, becomes more and more important, because these cityscapes disappear. We don't know how was Russia looking before before long ago. The importance of these photo collections is incredible, because whatever they restore, they have to come to our museum to ask for this material, and we are giving this material. That's why I think that it would be interesting to show you a portion of this collection, because this you won't see anywhere else. Because these are the photos of the past life of the, and you must understand that the known images of the two capitals, two Russian capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, are not the whole Russia. It's not the whole. Actually, the Russia led quite a different life from the life that is in the capitals. Like in America, it's exactly the same. New York is not the whole America. Exactly, in Russia is the same. Moscow and St. Petersburg are countries inside the country. The real Russian life is not there, and the main bulk of the population is not living in these two capitals. So if I show you a collection, just a portion of our collection, we're now preparing a big exhibition. It's a part of that work. We want to call it Russia Without the Two Capitals. Because it's really important to understand what was this country like in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And we mixed up all this material. We mixed the Soviet era and the pre-Soviet era just to create an image of the ordinary mainland small town, let's say so. And we have to understand, by the way, I will explain our ideas, what does it mean, why do we make that choice? This is a kind of a symbolical beginning of this portion of my story. This is the monastery called Ipatьевский монастырь. It is a monastery which is close to one of the Russian small towns, and this is the monastery where the Russian Romanovs family started to be there. This Romanov dynasty was started. This was the place where to the grandfather of Peter the Great, he was still a child, a committee of boyars came and they said, you will become the Tsar. And so the dynasty of Romanov started in this Ipatьевский monastery. We have a very rare photo of the building where the dynasty of Romanovs 300 years later ended their story. They ceased to be the Tsars of Russia. And strangely enough, it's a mystical coincidence. It's called the Ipatьевский dom. The same very rare name belonged to the merchant who was owning this building. This is the very rare photo of the Ipatьевский dom, where they were killed, the Romanovs. So nobody has this photo, only we. It's a very rare photo because the building was destroyed later, and so we see the photo of the Ipatьевский monastery and the Ipatьевский dom, which is a very strange symbolical coincidence. With the same name was attached to the beginning and to the end of the Romanov story. Now, to illustrate the idea that Kremlin is not a specifically Moscow phenomenon, we made a collection of all the Kremlins in other cities, other towns, because these fortresses were normal phenomenon not only in Moscow but also in this is the Rostov Veliki. This is, you see there are Kremlins in different cities. This is in Astrakhan. This is in Kazan. It was a tradition to build fortresses at the center. It's a purely Russian tradition. The building, the tradition, architecturally it's Italian. It's an Italian fortress because introduced by the Russian Tsars. Here I want to make a step aside and tell you what it has some meaning because of the Kremlin. At the Venice Biennale, we wrote an introduction. The idea was that in Russia, which is a big country and very centralized, only the central power was always deciding what will be the next in their architecture. It was Tsar Vasily III who invited Italians, and they built these Kremlins. And on the federal level, let's say so, at the very center, the ruler decided what to build. And a new tradition started. It became Russian. Much later, Peter the Great invited Dutch architects, English architects, and German architects, and a couple of Italians to create the image of his newly started city, capital, St. Petersburg. Later, and they created the new style, which became later the Russian style. Catherine II, Catherine the Great, she also invited French and Italians to build, to create this an ideal city of the period of the Enlightenment era. And much later, the Soviet power was patronizing the constructivists for a while. Then they changed their mind. They started that the next step would be another type of architecture, the new imperial architecture. So Russia is very strange. It's not like the democratic America. It's always a decision on the state level what will be the next step in architecture, and it's still going on. Right now, we all in a way expect, I will tell you about that later, that we all expect that the Kremlin will take a bold decision about reintroducing the new architecture in Russia. It's the only hope, because on the local level, it's something horrible is going on. But let's go on. Now, this is a typical square in a typical Russian building of the Soviet era. You see a building it's Nizhny Novgorod. This is a typical cinema of the Soviet period. This is a typical bath of the Soviet period. The public baths were very important in Russia, because nobody had hot water, so they had to go to a public place to wash themselves. So it's a very typical building of the medium-sized Russian town. A typical post office. A tram. It's a mixture of images. I repeat, we did that on purpose, of the Soviet and pre-Soviet era, because the life didn't change much. Actually, the Soviets didn't build a lot during the Soviet period. Only at the Khrushchev's time they started to build a lot. A typical Russian town is always on a river. This is a very typical view. You see buildings of the Soviet period, of constructivist period, which are not bright examples, but this is the way how this style was reverberating in the province. You see these buildings like that. I mean, these are the remnants of the constructivist, very simplified constructivist housing with a fancy fountain, very fancy monuments of the Soviet period. Typical view on the bank of a river. Very, very typical Russian view of a city. Always on a hill, always by the river. An example of wooden architecture, an example of a railway station. Also, it could be anywhere in Russia. The views of provincial life, which is a very sweet remembrance. All this disappeared. Actually, in Russia, nothing is. All the wooden buildings, wooden houses, are rotting. Nobody repairs them. The art is lost. The tradition is cut. It's not only these photos keep the image of the life and of the architectural surrounding of that period. And it's very important to understand this background and this atmosphere to Then when you will talk a bit later about the constructivist period, you will understand the surprise, and it was a real explosion that in this milieu something absolutely new was born. It was a miracle. But we will talk about a bit later when we will see the images of Russia, which will, I repeat, you will never see anywhere. This type of a house made of wooden lace, I would say, nobody will repeat now. This is a funny monument. They were building it as a church, and then they put later Lenin on top of it. You see kind of a Russian Toledo in a way. Typical central square in the provincial Russian city. Now from this I want to move to the revolutionary events that happened in this architectural atmosphere. All of a sudden, in the Soviet period, don't you think that these houses look very, very well, fresh, modern? They are not something spectacular, but these are the houses. This is the mass democratic housing for the worker class, built in the 20s. In 20s they start. This is the houses for the working class built by the constructivist revolutionaries. You see how really modern they look. You see here a horse. This is Moscow. It's a new region made by these young revolutionaries, because later, of course, this style was abandoned, but this is a very interesting photo of that period, because really this building could be built today. And this is not, what do you think it is? Also one of the most interesting photos in our collection. It's a huge, it's an old photo, and a photo of 1929. It's a building, it's a Corbusier building in Moscow. Because actually the biggest building of Corbusier that was built in the world, because he's the famous building for the Ministry of Light Industry, which is now called Centro Soyuz. It's built in Moscow in the beginning of the 30s, and we have here very rare photos of the process of the building. You see, it's still with this. This is another constructivist building. So I mean, Corbusier was building in Russia. This is really surprising. But not only this, he was inspired by Russians. This was the 20s, as we already mentioned, this idea, was the only period when this provincial and strange and rich and unlucky country became architecturally important for the whole world. It was the only period where the works of students, architectural students, became immediately known, were published everywhere, and were noticed by everybody, and these people became really, the very young people were influencing the architecture of the whole world. I'll give you now only two examples, but very bright examples. One will be Komarova. This is a lady. This is a lady. She died only a few months ago. This is 1923. Students, the famous Vkhutemas, went on vacation to Crimea, and she, in the middle, sitting a young girl. She is 23 at that moment. Around are all friends. These children, and a bit later, all of them became very important, famous architects. And this lady, this girl at that moment, she died only a few months ago. She was 100 years old. We made a big anniversary for her, the celebration in the museum. She was very happy. She made a speech. She received a lot of gifts, and a couple of months later she died. But, well, it's of course very nice that an architect lives up to such old age. But if we look what she did, she built a lot, by the way. In the Talyzin era, she survived and she changed her style, and she built, for instance, the biggest university, except the Moscow University, in the so-called Bauman Institute in Moscow. She was quite an active architect. But what she did when she was young, in 1929, she made it was her diploma project. She made this publication. This was the building for the Comintern. It was never built, but believe me, it influenced the world architecture. It was I repeat you, it was the only period when you as students must be inspired by the fact that the work of a student can be so important. This was just the work of a student. But look, doesn't that resemble you something? I think it does. And she did that. She was a young girl, and she did that. This is Komarova. Now, at the same year was born, but much earlier, before that, died another another important figure is in Russian architectural history. Maybe this man is the most talented architect in the whole Russian history. And the tragedy is that he never built a building. This is a group of the same age like Komarova. They were both 100 years old last year, but he died in 1957. He was destroyed because he was, as a student, here he is in the middle. Here he is. As a student, he was. As a student, he became very famous because all his projects immediately were noticed by everybody. He became a star. But he built, in the whole his life, he built only one staircase on a hill in south of Russia, in Kislovodsk. This is the only thing that he managed to build. After a while, he was thrown when the new style was introduced by Stalin. This man was thrown out, and he was in a way destroyed. You see here his late photo, something in 25 years later, after this one. Here he is. He started drinking, and he worked for all his life. He was drawing and doing, inventing, and his influence is very big. And on his 100th anniversary, we made an exhibition because we are keeping the whole. Whatever is left after this man is in our museum. And Rem Koolhaas came specially to the opening because he said, that this man is my teacher. This man is the only one actually who is my teacher. He's my God, he said. Because whatever he does is very, very. He's even more important than the ordinary Russian constructivist, even more important than Melnikov, because what he predicted the current architecture. If I will show you now a few examples of the material that we have in our collection, and you will understand that I'm correct, because what he did is what we are doing now. The collection is the stuff that has survived after Leonidov is not much. It's only something like 100 pieces. And this is only the only stuff that is the real, the originals that have survived after this man. But he was the first to invent a lot of very modern ideas. I'm showing you that now. He was the first to propose a very flat building standing by a very flat building laying on this structure, which we know now is everybody is doing that. These are his projects. Look, this was maybe he was the first in the world to introduce such a very simple minimalistic solution. Doesn't that resemble you? A lot of things. Doesn't that resemble you, Chandigarh, for instance? I will show you some examples. And Corbusier knew him quite well, and he wrote about him very inspired texts. He said that maybe he's the only hope of the Russian architecture. He wrote fantastic things about him. And we can see, if we see, this is his greatest project, we keep it. This is maybe the most precious stuff in our museum, to my taste, I would say. This is a project he was proposing to build on the Red Square. It is a combination of three tall towers. One is round, one is triangular, one is rectangular, and another volume here which is geometrically strange, but it's hyperboloid. Here you see. It is one of the greatest projects, I would say, in the history of architecture, because at that moment it was not. He went very long, much further than the constructivist ideas. He was the first to introduce industrial shapes as shapes of the building, and geometrical shapes more sophisticated than the constructivist rectangles. Look, we have all the. He made a lot of drawings around this idea. We keep all of them. Look. And Kohlhaas, when you see this is the space. It was a very tall tower. You see here the Bolshoi Theater. He was proposing to build that on the Red Square. Of course, it was in a way an incredible idea. It wasn't built, but he was playing with this theme all the time. Another drawing. You see two towers. One is the round one is here, the rectangular one is here. And if you look at it, you will see that the shapes of industrial shapes here, he was the first in the world to come up with such an idea. And of course, this strange plane flying is somehow grim, I would say, if you compare with the story of the 11th of September. But Kohlhaas, on the opening, he said that I don't see any better project for New York, for the World Trade Center site, than this one. I will make a proposal, let them build this one. And he was very serious. He was not joking. He was, of course, it will not happen, but it would be wonderful, because this is one of the most exciting projects in the history of architecture, I would say. Here, he made a lot of drawings, and he made also drawings of this. You see how it will look on the Red Square. Those who have been at the Red Square, they will understand that it's a very, very strong. It's not a contradiction. It's an exciting comparison between the Kremlin, this Italian fortress, let's say so, and these absolutely avant-garde towers. And he was drawing all the time this combination of the, for instance, St. Basil's Cathedral and these towers on them. And the view of these towers through the Kremlin. He was somehow obsessed with this image, but in a way it's a pity. Here you see the old engraving with his towers added. He did these drawings. I think it's absolutely incredibly beautiful. I will make an enlargement, you'll see. I think it would be great if they would build that. But other projects by Leonidov, this actually, all what is left after this, I repeat you, the greatest Russian architects. You see, he was doing these minimalistic shapes pyramid, semi circles, which are now becoming very important. Now I would cut off if you. Can you put on the light, I mean? Can you put on the light in the hall, or it's difficult? Okay. Now I want to tell you, I described the situation in Russian architecture. It was like that, then it was a revolutionary period. Now we have a situation that I wouldn't like to show you any pictures of the current situation, because there is no modern architecture. The taste of the local, the federal architecture dropped the manner in a way. The local mayors, the local ruling gangs are doing whatever they want. What they built is incredible. Moscow is destroyed. St. Petersburg will be destroyed very quickly because there is a money flow now to that city. The provincial Russia is in hands also of the local authorities. The only hope is that the federal government will realize again, after a long period of absence, as a decision makers, that they should build something important. Actually, they did. That's why the story that we told on the Venice Biennale about the two theaters, I'm not showing the picture because you know that it's the work of your Eric Moss. The work that Eric made for the Mariinsky Theater is vitally important for Russia, because it was for the first time the project of this level will be done. And the decision is done by the federal government, and it is really it's not just another nice project which everybody loves. Actually, it was a success on Biennale. It's a historical turning point in Russia. For the first time after a long period, the federal government is making a decision, and they are bringing in really good architecture, and it's modern. And it will be, if that happens, a new period will start in Russia. Even if that will not happen, at least it is a reason. For instance, there are not rumors. We change the situation like that. The people who don't want this project started fighting against it. For instance, the chief architect of St. Petersburg, he hates the project. He doesn't want it. But he started, as the last resort, he started to fight for the right to make an international competition for this site. This is already a revolution. The international competition didn't happen in our country since 1931. So after 70 years of absence, all of a sudden we have an international competition. And those who are with all their guts hate the idea of international competition, they are fighting for the right. This is funny, strange, and great at the same time. We will have this competition probably. There is a decision made already. It will be announced. They don't know how to do it because the tradition, the ability is lost. But nevertheless, the very fact that they are trying to do it is historical. And it's only Eric, Frederick, and Laurie Smith, and in a way Peter Neuber, who introduced us to each other. We did that. This is really interesting that it happened. And when I say we did that, I must explain you that's not personally I. It's the museum. Our museum became very active in this process. We are provoking, we are giving advice, we are the source of expertise, we are influencing the situation very actively. And this is not well, isolated event. I think that the museums all over the world become very important. The story that happened in Bilbao is typical. I mean, in different ways, museums become very active because they are structuring the world. And now we have another idea. That's why I'm showing you very old, very rare photos of the Kremlin, because this is the so-called big. Show the picture again. This is the so-called big stone bridge by the Kremlin. It was replaced by the one that everybody knows. It's a postcard view. And this is a view from the Kremlin with the Christ the Savior, the cathedral. And this is the small stone bridge. Both were replaced by modern, more modern structures. We have an idea that by this bridge, on this historical spot, which you can see from here, between the Christ the Savior and the Kremlin, somewhere here, there is a possibility to build a modern building. And it can be anybody important. It can be Frank Gehry, it can be Eric Moss, it can be somebody else, but this is our museum is involved in that. This is incredible. I'm surprised and inspired at the same time. I think that it's very, it's the sign of our time, that museums are becoming so important. So probably after a while you'll hear the continuation of this story. What I want to tell you that this flight, which is only 12 hours, and it's so easy. I think that we have to establish a very important link between Los Angeles and Moscow, in a way to pierce the globe. Because we are planning to open an outlet of our museum to show our collections. Will be very instructive for the young generation of architects to see, to see what is an architectural collection, and we'll bring different exhibitions on a systematic basis, showing old stuff, new stuff, and I think it will be very important for the education and also for the possible links, because maybe the fresh ideas will come from here to Russia. It will somehow they will work backwards. Russia gave birth to a lot of. When I went through your exhibitions today, I saw a lot of things that definitely were started and that heroical period in Russia. And now they're everywhere. Now they're the basis of the education. But probably your school of young talents could somehow save Russia from its architectural misery in which we are now. So this link, and to do that, you have to be clever enough, and also you have to understand the local situation. By sitting here, you will not do that. Or you have to get acquainted with the collections, with the information that we have. Or you have to fly there, make this trip many times, this 12 hours. Both ways are, I think, can be used, because this is really, life is changing. These trips are becoming easier, and there is a rule that if to travel from one place to another you need only 2 hours, these two places are not different culturally at all. Here we need 12 hours, but the distance is becoming smaller and smaller, as you understand. So probably really very soon we will live in one global village, but nevertheless, let's start this process like we're doing that. So that's it. I think I should stop talking. I can talk for hours. I can answer any questions if you want. Yes, we are collecting all that, and also we started a new collection. It's a very fantastic story. When they were inventing these first spacecrafts for the Soviet effort in space, the wife of one of the engineers happened to be an architect. She graduated from the Moscow Architectural School, which is headed by Kudryavtsev, as you know. And she said, I could invent you something. And she, on her enthusiasm, she started to draw some interiors for them. And later she became working on them on a permanent basis. On just one woman. No, they didn't think about design, or she was just making functional drawings. But actually, one woman created the whole era of the interiors of the Russian spacecrafts. Incredibly beautiful. This is very stylish. All of them, it's the style of the 60s and 70s. It's a huge collection. She gave that whole collection to us. We will keep it forever. It's a very interesting story. Yes, it's absolutely unique, but the developer, Frederick Smith, so dear to my heart, he was crazy enough to do it, because nobody else. You have to have the guts to not be afraid of this strange country, to spend a lot of money, to be honest. And to go there, to be insist, and he still didn't win. I mean, he didn't get any project yet to do, but he caused a revolution already. It is now everybody admits, and we saw that at the very beginning. That I understood that what we are doing will be very important. Believe me, it's part of it's a milestone of Russian architectural history. What happened already. Right now, it's a kind of a revolution going on in Russian architecture.
Are they aware of where this started, this plan from Los Angeles to Russia?
They don't. No, they are not. They're animals. They're political animals. Their moves are caused by stimulus reaction. But at the end, if you analyze them from a side, you understand what happened. But of course, the clever architectural critics, we have a good crowd. It's not big. They're quite clever people. They realize what happened. They do.
You should explain to them how in the 20s, the students went immediately to the school like SCI-Arc and just started.
Yes, this was, I repeat you, it was a fantastic period when students, Russian students, of course the country was fresh, everybody was new, everything was new. The students, like the ones that you are sitting here, they started building immediately after their bench. They finished even on the bench. They were still students, but the building were being built already. It was a fantastic period. And they really, not everything could be built, of course, because Leonid was creating buildings, incredible, floating big balloon in the air, a building like that. It still cannot be built, but this project became known all over the world immediately. This was the only period when the students' work were becoming noticed by everybody.
The idea that the owner thing that the three towers were
1924. But really, these three towers are very beautiful. I enjoy. Actually, one of the drawings is hanging in my office all the time. I'm looking on it. So anyway, if there are if there are questions, ask me. If not, all of you are welcome to our museum, because it's open for the researchers, for the students, and for other museums. We have a lot of connections. We are doing now more and more exhibitions because it's very good to come and see. So you are. Yeah.